There is a moment in the Gospel of Matthew that has haunted sincere hearts for 2,000 years. A moment so violent in its tenderness, so deliberate in its mercy, that when you finally understand what was really happening on that water, on that dark and wind-torn night, nothing about the way you read the Bible will ever be the same. It is not simply the story of a man walking on water. It is not merely an account of fear and faith. It is the story of a surgical act of divine love, a love so precise, so knowing, so unyielding in its purpose, that it allowed a man to go under before it pulled him back up. And the question that should shake you to your core is this: why? Why did Jesus wait? Why, if he could calm every storm with a single word, did he allow Peter to feel the waves closing over him, the cold terror of the deep rising around him before he reached out his hand? The answer to that question does not live on the surface of the text. It lives in the deep current beneath it, in the Jewish world that shaped these men, in the Hebrew understanding of water and chaos and covenant, in the Greek words that Matthew chose to describe what happened in that decisive instant. And when you go there, when you descend into the actual soil from which this story grew, you find something that will leave you breathless. You find that the sinking was not an accident. You find that Jesus did not arrive late. You find that the hand was always there, waiting, not absent, and that the moment Peter began to go under was precisely the moment the lesson had to be completed, or it would never be learned at all. The night begins in exhaustion. Jesus had just performed one of the most staggering acts in his entire ministry. He had fed more than 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish, Matthew 14:13-21. The crowd was enormous, the miracle undeniable, and the momentum of the moment was electric. John's Gospel tells us that the people were so moved that they wanted to take Jesus by force and make him king, John 6:15. This was the nationalistic fever of first-century Judea, concentrated into a single, explosive instant. The messianic expectations of the Jewish people had been burning for generations under the heel of Roman occupation. And here was a man who could feed an army, heal the sick, and command the natural world. In their minds, they had found their liberating king. And Jesus, in one of the most telling decisions of his entire ministry, immediately withdrew. Matthew 14:22 says he compelled the disciples. The Greek is anakason. He constrained them, urged them with authority, to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. Then he dismissed the crowds and went up the mountain alone to pray, Matthew 14:23. This detail matters enormously. He did not linger. He did not celebrate. He moved with urgency because the temptation being offered by the crowd was not spiritually neutral. The kingdom Jesus came to establish was not a political revolt. It was not a liberation army. It was something the disciples themselves could not yet fully understand, and the danger of their misunderstanding was very real. So he sent them ahead by boat across the Sea of Galilee, a body of water the Hebrew Bible calls Yam Kinneret, a lake that sits nearly 700 feet below sea level, enclosed by hills that funnel wind into sudden and violent storms with terrifying unpredictability. The disciples were experienced fishermen. Several of them, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, had grown up on this water. They were not afraid of it under normal conditions. But what Matthew describes in verse 24 is not normal conditions. The boat was already many stadia from land, battered by waves, because the wind was against them, Matthew 14:24. The Greek word translated battered is basanizomenon, a word that in other contexts is used for torment, for being pressed to the limit. Matthew is not being casual here. He is painting a picture of a situation that has moved beyond the merely difficult into something that feels violent and purposeful in its hostility. These men were fighting hard, and they had been doing so for hours. The 4th watch of the night in Roman reckoning falls between 3 and 6 in the morning. The disciples had been on that water in darkness and wind for the better part of the night. This is the moment Jesus came to them, walking on the water. And the first thing they did was cry out in terror, because they thought he was a ghost. Matthew 14:26. The Greek word Matthew uses is phantasma, an apparition, a spectre. In Jewish thinking, the sea was not merely a geographical feature, it was a theological symbol. Since the very beginning, in the deep grammar of the Hebrew Bible, the waters represented chaos, the unordered formlessness that preceded creation, the domain of the Tehom, the deep. Genesis 1:2. The sea was where Leviathan moved, the great creature of chaos that God alone had mastered. Psalm 74:13-14. To walk on the sea in the Jewish symbolic imagination was to exercise dominion over chaos itself. Only God walked on the waters. Job 9:8 says that God alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. Psalm 77:19 declares that God's way was through the sea, his path through the mighty waters. When the disciples saw a figure walking on the water in the middle of the night, their minds did not go to miracle. They went to the supernatural, and not in a comforting direction. Jesus immediately spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Matthew 14:27. And here, in the original Greek, Matthew records something that every educated Jew reading this account would have recognized instantly. Jesus does not say, "It is me, Jesus." He says, "Ego eimi, I am." This is the exact Greek equivalent of the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush, which the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures that was the Bible of first-century Greek-speaking Jews, renders as ego eimi in Exodus 3:14. Jesus, walking on the chaos waters in the middle of the night, announces himself with the covenant name of God. He is not simply reassuring frightened men. He is making a declaration that any Jew schooled in the Scriptures would have felt in his bones. The one who commands the primordial deep is here, and he is me. It is precisely at this moment that Peter does something that reveals everything about who he is. He says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Matthew 14:28. Theologians and preachers have debated this verse for centuries. Some see it as great faith, some see it as presumption. But whatever one makes of the motivation, the word "if" deserves careful attention. In the Greek, the word is a conditional particle. Peter has heard the voice. He has seen the figure. What Peter is doing here is something very characteristic of him throughout the Gospels. He is leaping forward, reaching to participate in the divine action he is witnessing rather than simply receive it. He is not the disciple of calm and measured reflection. He is the disciple of impulse and fire, the one who will later draw a sword in Gethsemane, John 18:10, the one who will swear he will never deny Jesus and then do so 3 times before dawn, Matthew 26:33-35, 69-75. Peter does not watch. Peter jumps. And Jesus said, "Come," Matthew 14:29. One word. A single syllable in Greek, eltha. And with that one word, Peter stepped out of the boat. He stepped out of the only solid surface in that entire scene. He stepped out onto chaos water in the dark, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, with waves all around him and wind howling in his ears. And for a moment, for one extraordinary, impossible, glorious moment, it worked. Peter walked on the water. The text says, he walked on the water and came toward Jesus, Matthew 14:29. This man, this fisherman from Galilee, this utterly ordinary human being, walked on the sea. He did what only God does in the imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures. He did it because Jesus told him to, and because he fixed his attention on Jesus and moved. But then something happened. Matthew 14:30 says he saw that the wind was strong, and he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" The Greek verb for beginning to sink is katapontinzestai, a compound verb carrying the sense of being swallowed by the deep, of being engulfed and of going under. This is not a stumble. This is a man sinking into the water. The chaos that Jesus walked over without sinking is now pulling Peter down into itself. And the reason Matthew gives is devastatingly simple. He saw the wind and was afraid. He redirected his attention from the word that had called him out onto the water to the environmental conditions surrounding him. And the moment he did, the walking ended. Now we reach the question that this entire narrative has been building toward. Matthew 14:31 says, "Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him." The Greek word for immediately is eutheos, without delay, at once. But here it produces a theological observation that should resound through every believing heart. If Jesus responded immediately when Peter cried out, if the hand was extended without delay the instant the cry left Peter's lips, then Jesus was already there. He was already close enough to catch Peter in that very instant, which means that during every second Peter was sinking, during the moment the water began to rise over him, Jesus was right there, present, watching. He was not running to catch up. He was not absent. He was there. And he did not reach out his hand until Peter cried out. The question is not whether Jesus could have acted sooner. The question is why he did not. And the answer lives in what Jesus said when he caught him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:31. The word translated little faith is oligopistos, a compound of oligos, meaning small or insufficient, and pistis, meaning faith. Jesus uses this same word 4 other times in Matthew's Gospel, and in every instance it is addressed to disciples, never to outsiders, never to Pharisees, never to the crowds. Matthew 6:30, 8:26, 16:8, and here in 14:31. Oligopistos is not the word for no faith. It is the word for faith that has started well, but collapsed under pressure. It is the word for faith that exists in calm, but dissolves when the wind is strong. It is a diagnostic word, not a condemnation. Jesus is not mocking Peter. He is performing surgery on the specific place where Peter's trust was breaking down. And this is the key to understanding why the hand waited. If Jesus had caught Peter before he began to sink, if he had steadied him at the first wobble, if he had prevented the terror of the descent, Peter would never have known with absolute bodily experiential certainty what it felt like for faith to fail. He would have a story about walking on water. He would not have a story about what happens when you take your eyes off Jesus and what it feels like when his hand finds you in the deep. There is a category of knowledge that cannot be acquired by observation. It can only be acquired by going through. And the knowledge that Jesus was going to burn into Peter that night, the knowledge that his hand is present even in the sinking, that his rescue is immediate in the moment of genuine cry, that the deep cannot swallow you when you cry his name. That knowledge required Peter to actually sink. The Jewish background of this moment deepens its meaning immeasurably. The Psalms that shaped Peter's entire inner world are saturated with water imagery as a metaphor for overwhelming crisis. Psalm 69, 1-2 cries, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire, where there is no foothold." Psalm 18:16 declares, "He sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters." Psalm 144:7 pleads, "Stretch out your hand from on high, rescue me and deliver me from the many waters." The physical experience Peter had that night on the Sea of Galilee was the lived bodily embodiment of the deepest cry of Jewish spirituality across 1,000 years of Psalms. He was not just a man sinking in a lake. He was every soul that had ever cried to God from the place of overwhelming darkness, every person for whom the chaos had closed over their head. And the hand that found him was the same hand the psalmists had been singing about for generations. This is what Jesus was building. He was not being slow or indifferent. He was turning a moment on a lake into a permanent theological imprint on one of the men who would carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. Peter would stand before the Sanhedrin one day and refuse to stop preaching in the name of Jesus, saying to the council, "We must obey God rather than men." Acts 5:29. Peter would be chained between soldiers in a prison and be freed by an angel while he slept, walking out past iron gates that opened on their own. Acts 12:6-10. Peter would write from the seasoned end of his life that believers should cast all their anxieties on God, because he cares for them. 1 Peter 5:7. None of that authority comes from nowhere. All of it is anchored to a night on a lake, when he went under, and a hand found him in the deep. But there is something else in this passage that the surface reading almost entirely obscures, and it may be the most important detail of all. When Peter and Jesus got into the boat, Matthew 14:32-33 tells us that the wind stopped, and those in the boat worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Greek word for worshipped is prosekuneson, from proskuneo, the act of falling before someone in reverence. In the New Testament, this word is used in the highest sense for the worship of God, Matthew 4:10, Revelation 4:10. And the disciples here offer it to Jesus without hesitation or correction. These men, Jews raised on the Shema, on the absolute confession that the Lord alone is God, looked at Jesus standing in that boat and fell before him. This is not merely an emotional response to a miracle. It is a theological conclusion drawn from the totality of what they had just witnessed. The ego eimi on the water, the mastery over the chaos sea, the immediate hand in the sinking, the wind ceasing at his arrival. All of it led them to the only conclusion that could contain it all. Truly you are the Son of God. What God was saying to every person who would ever read this text goes far beyond the story of one fisherman on one lake on one night. He was saying that the presence of a storm does not mean the absence of God. He was saying that the experience of sinking is not evidence of abandonment. He was saying that the cry, the genuine, desperate, nothing held back cry of, "Lord, save me," is never met with silence. Not because God was watching from a distance and rushed over when he heard it, but because he was already there, already close, waiting for the moment when the pretense of self-sufficiency had fully dissolved and the heart was finally open enough to receive what had been offered all along. Peter's mistake was not that he stepped out of the boat. That step was an act of obedience and extraordinary courage. Peter's mistake was the precise moment he chose to focus on the wind instead of on Jesus. The moment he allowed the visible evidence of his circumstances to become more real to him than the word spoken directly to him by the Son of God. And this is the mistake that every human being who has ever lived has made. We feel the wind. We hear it. We measure it. We calculate our odds against it. And in the calculating, we forget who spoke us onto the water in the first place. The mercy of this passage, and it is the deepest mercy, is that it does not end with the sinking. It ends with the hand that did not prevent the sinking, but caught it. The hand that allowed the terror to run its full course so that the lesson could be fully written in the body, in the memory, in the marrow of the man who would one day be told by the risen Jesus, "Feed my sheep." John 21:17. This is the way divine love teaches what it must teach. Not the removal of the difficulty, but the revelation of the presence within the difficulty. Not rescue before sinking, but rescue in sinking. Not faith that has never been tested, but faith that went under and came back up with a hand holding it. There is a reason Jesus waited. He waited because the hand extended at the surface before the going under would have been received as a gesture of help. The hand extended in the deep, in the moment of total helplessness and genuine cry, was received as salvation. And that difference, that specific, precise, irreducible difference between a gesture of help and an act of salvation, is the very core of the gospel message. Not that God assists those who are managing on their own and struggling a little, but that God reaches into the place where the water has already closed, where the strength is already gone, where the only thing left is the name on the lips, and pulls up. Peter never forgot that hand. In every sermon he preached, in every prison he entered, in every letter he wrote, somewhere in the bedrock of his being, there was the physical memory of going under and being caught. Jesus put that memory there deliberately. He designed the moment. He held the hand back at the precise right time and extended it at the precise right moment. Not because he was indifferent to the terror, but because he was building something in Peter that could not be built any other way. The kind of faith that has been to the bottom and knows, from the bottom, that it is not alone. There is also a dimension of this story that becomes visible only when we trace it forward through the full arc of Peter's life, because this night on the water was not the last time he would experience this same pattern. A night was coming when Peter would stand by a charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest, surrounded by people pressing him with questions, and the wind of fear would be strong, and he would take his eyes off Jesus, and he would sink in a very different way. He would deny 3 times that he even knew the man. Matthew 26:69-75. And in that sinking, in that courtyard, Luke records with devastating precision that Jesus turned and looked at Peter, Luke 22:61, not with condemnation, not with disgust, with a look that Peter understood because he had seen those eyes before, on the water, when the hand had come in the deep. And Peter went out and wept bitterly, Luke 22:62. The hand that caught him on the water was already in the purposes of God, reaching toward that courtyard, and then toward the breakfast on the beach in John 21, where the risen Jesus would ask Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Restoring what the denials had broken, extending again the hand that never truly withdrew. The pattern is consistent across every terrain of Peter's life: the water, the courtyard, the beach. In every instance, Jesus allowed the going under to happen before the restoration. Because the restoration that follows real collapse is categorically different from the encouragement that precedes it. Jesus was not managing Peter's confidence. He was forging Peter's foundation at the deepest possible level. This should also permanently reshape how every believing reader understands the nature of faith itself. There has grown in many streams of Christian teaching a tendency to equate faith with the absence of fear, with certainty, with unbroken confidence. By this standard, a person who is afraid, who is sinking, who is crying out in desperation, has somehow failed. But the text of Matthew 14 does not say that Peter, with what Jesus himself called little faith, still stepped out of the boat. He still walked on water. He still cried the right name when he was going under. And the hand still came. Little faith that calls out to Jesus in genuine need is not failed faith. It is faith doing exactly what it was made to do. 3 words in Greek: Kyrie, soson me, Lord, save me. These may be the most theologically complete words a human being can speak. They contain the recognition of lordship. Jesus is Kyrios, the Lord, the word the Septuagint uses to translate the divine name YHWH throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. They contain the confession of absolute need, soson, save me, from the verb sozo, the very verb at the root of the name Yeshua, Jesus, whose name means precisely this, WH saves, and they contain the personal me, not a theological proposition, not a generalized prayer for humanity. Save me. This man, at this depth, in this darkness, right now. Jesus was waiting for those words, not because he needed the information, but because Peter needed to speak them, because the full weight of what it means to be saved can only be received by someone who has fully arrived at the point of needing it. You cannot truly love the rescue if you have never truly experienced the drowning, the compassion that would mark Peter's entire apostolic life, the shepherd's heart, the fierce protectiveness of the vulnerable, the tenderness toward those who had failed and returned, was not formed in his successes. It was forged in a lake, going under and being caught. If you are reading this or listening to this from a place where you feel like you are sinking, where the wind is strong and the waves are higher than your head, then hear this clearly. The hand is not absent. The delay is not indifference. The water rising around you is not the end of your story. It may be the most important middle of it, the precise place where the cry has to become so real, so total, so stripped of every pretense, that when the hand comes, you will never in the rest of your life mistake it for anything other than exactly what it is. The Son of God walked on the water in the dark so that you would never have to drown in it alone. Comment below and tell us where in the world you are hearing or reading this message today. From which city, which country, which corner of the earth did this word find you? We want to know.